Welcome everyone to This Explainer. Today we're unraveling a real high-stakes engineering detective story, one that has literally puzzled rocket scientists for decades. We're going to explore exactly why these massive, incredibly powerful solid rocket motors sometimes just vibrate violently during flight, and how a team of engineers used absolutely mind-boggling supercomputer simulations to finally crack the case. It's a crazy story of turbulent physics, massive computing power, and why perfect mathematical models sometimes, well, completely fail to capture messy reality.
Just imagine millions of pounds of thrust propelling a launch vehicle toward space. It's awesome, right? But inside these large segmented solid propellant boosters, something hidden is going on. Unpredictable, low-frequency pressure and thrust oscillations start to build up. And these vibrations, they are incredibly dangerous. They can completely jeopardize the motor structures, wreak havoc on the thrust vector control systems, and cause a severely uncomfortable and potentially disastrous ride for whatever payload or crew is sitting on top. Okay, let's dive into this and see what exactly triggers these dangerous shakes.
So, the primary culprit behind all this violent shaking is a physical phenomenon known as vortex shedding. As the solid propellant burns and the hot gas flows really rapidly down the chamber of the rocket, it actually passes over edges and geometric changes in the propellant grain, and this creates regions of intense high shear in the gas flow. The flow essentially trips over these edges, becomes hydrodynamically unstable, and detaches. This spins off a continuous alternating stream of swirling vortices right into the rocket chamber.
But, a few swirling vortices alone aren't enough to literally shake a rocket apart. The real danger happens when these vortices team up with the acoustics of the rocket chamber in what's known as the Rossiter acoustic feedback loop. Here's how this four-step loop actually works. First, a vortex forms by the roll-up of the shear layer at the grain edge. Second, it gets carried super fast downstream and crashes right into the nozzle wall. Third, that crash sends a sound wave, an acoustic disturbance, traveling backward, upstream. And finally, that sound wave reaches the original edge and perfectly triggers the birth of a brand new vortex. Think of it exactly like blowing air over the edge of a flute. You're creating a continuous acoustic feedback loop that sustains a really loud, powerful vibration. Except inside a rocket, that flute note is essentially a physical sledgehammer.
For years, engineers tried to predict these pressure oscillations using two-dimensional computer simulations. But there was this massive, glaring mystery. These 2D models constantly predicted extremely violent shaking and sky-high pressure fluctuations, especially right after ignition. But in real-life physical test firings, the rockets experienced much lower, entirely manageable levels of vibration. It was wild. The computers said the rocket should literally be tearing itself apart, but reality said something totally different. Engineers were totally puzzled. Clearly, something in the physics was completely missing from their 2D math.
To find out what was going wrong, researchers turned to a very specific physical test object, the Onera C1XB laboratory-scale solid rocket motor. Now, it's a simple, small-scale motor, but it was ingeniously designed with a chamfered propellant edge placed right in the middle of the chamber. This specific geometry was deliberately chosen because it places the edge right at the node of the acoustic pressure field. What does that mean in plain English? Well, it was built to deliberately maximize this exact vortex-shedding acoustic loop so engineers could study it in its absolute most extreme form.
The researchers realized that treating a three-dimensional rocket as a two-dimensional slice was likely the root of the problem. I mean, the real world is 3D, right? And turbulence is intensely 3D. So they decided to recreate the Onera motor using a high-fidelity 3D computational mesh, utilizing an approach called implicit large eddy simulation, or ILIS. But moving from 2D to 3D isn't just some minor software upgrade. It requires breaking the internal space of the rocket into tiny computational blocks. This incredibly detailed mesh required a staggering 26.74 million individual cells, with amazingly fine resolution, right where the shear layer detaches from the propellant grain.
Processing the physics of high-speed, incredibly hot gas flow across nearly 27 million cells takes astronomical computing power. To put that into perspective, to run just this single simulation, the researchers had to utilize the Marconi supercomputing facility, running the code across 1,088 processors simultaneously. And it still took approximately 3.5 million CPU hours to complete. That number is just wild, and it really emphasizes the sheer, incredible scale of the supercomputing effort required to solve this aerospace mystery. But all that computing power finally gave us the answer. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the side-by-side comparison of the swirling gas. On the bottom, you see the old 2D simulation. Notice those red and blue dots moving along the bottom wall? Those are perfect, unbroken, coherent vortex rings marching uniformly toward the nozzle. But look at the top. The new 3D simulation. It starts with a few neat rolls, sure, but they quickly tear apart into this chaotic, messy breakup of turbulence before they even reach the end.
We can actually see this breakdown even more clearly by isolating the turbulent structures in this absolutely beautiful view called a Q-criterion visualization. You can see the neat, annular rollers detaching from the edge on the left, but very quickly they destabilize and completely shatter into hundreds of small, worm-like turbulent structures. This is a phenomenon known as an energy cascade. Basically, the energy of that big, perfect vortex is dispersed into smaller and smaller scales. And here's the real secret. This messy, fine-scale 3D turbulence actually softens the blow. Because the neat smoke ring is destroyed, it can't crash uniformly into the nozzle wall. So the acoustic feedback loop is severely dampened.
By allowing the simulation to naturally become messy and turbulent in 3 dimensions, the computer model finally started behaving exactly like the real world. In fact, a highly surprising fact emerged from the data. The 3D simulation showed that the chaotic vortex shedding locked perfectly onto the motor's third acoustic mode, producing a dominant peak at exactly 2172 Hz. And guess what? This perfectly matched what was observed in real-life experimental tests. It was a vital detail that the old 2D models completely missed. The ultimate victory of the 3D model becomes super obvious when we map the intensity of the pressure fluctuations right along the wall of the rocket chamber. The orange dots represent the actual physical experimental data, the absolute truth of what the real rocket experienced. Look at the dashed line way up top. Yeah, that's the old 2D model, predicting wildly catastrophic vibration. And this brilliantly illustrates the breakthrough, because if you follow the solid black line of the new 3D ILS simulation, it perfectly threads the needle. It maps incredibly closely to those real-world orange dots from start to finish.
Looking at the signals over just a fraction of a second, you can see the red lines of the old 2D predictions showing these massive, high-amplitude, totally unrealistic spikes in pressure. Meanwhile, the green lines are our new 3D model. They are chaotic, yes, for sure, but they have a much, much lower amplitude. By proving that the vortices break down into small-scale turbulence, the researchers proved that capturing the messy reality of 3D fluid dynamics is absolutely essential for predicting the true acoustic coupling inside a rocket motor. So, what does this all mean, and what should you take away from this explainer? Well, we've learned that understanding the incredibly complex, chaotic nature of turbulence is the ultimate key to designing safer, more reliable rockets. It's literally this transition to fine-scale turbulence that keeps our solid rocket motors from vibrating themselves to pieces. But it definitely leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought. If unlocking 3D turbulence finally solved this mystery for a small laboratory-scale motor, what incredibly complex, hidden physics are just waiting to be discovered when we apply these massive supercomputer simulations to massive, full-scale space boosters? The journey to perfectly understanding rocket science, it seems, is still beautifully turbulent.